How does a bomber, down an engine and bleeding hydraulic lifeblood into the sky, refuse to die? Picture a flying fortress, ripped to shreds by flak, smoke trailing like a confession, its instruments dying one by one, and then, impossibly, it keeps flying. Not luck, not miracles. Something hidden, something forbidden, is keeping it alive. This is the story of a quiet rebellion inside an American airbase. A grease-stained mechanic who looked at a blueprint and saw a death sentence where everyone else saw perfection. What he did next didn't just save planes, it changed the odds for thousands of men. December 20th, 1943, an American airbase in England. Out of the gray sky comes a B17 Flying Fortress Lucky Strike, limping home, one engine coughing, skin shredded by German flak. It hangs low, trailing smoke and a dark, sticky streak where hydraulics have bled away. Every creak sounds like a prayer. Men on the ground go quiet. The bomber looks more like a ghost ship than a warplane, somehow holding together long enough to reach the runway. It touches down on one wheel and drags rubber shrieking, metal grinding, a comet of sparks scraping the runway. The Lucky Strike limping like a wounded giant refusing to die. Ground crews go still, then break into stunned cheers. Men call it a miracle. They want to believe it. But high above, in the control tower, someone is watching the instruments, not the applause. This looks miraculous, or so it seems. From the control tower, Colonel James Albertson watches the Lucky Strike's crooked landing like a man watching a conjurer finish a trick. The B-17 comes in on one wheel, slides down the runway in a spray of sparks and twisted metal, and the field smells of hydraulic fluid and thin luck. He doesn't feel relief. He feels something colder. This isn't a miracle. It defies physics. A man who reads aircraft for a living sees the math, the patterns. Systems don't survive hits like that. Someone on his base is breaking the rules, and Albertson knows that, if true, it will change everything. By late 1943, the hush had hardened into policy. The U.S. Army Air Forces had a problem they refused to admit publicly. The B-17, the Flying Fortress that crews swore by and reporters celebrated, had an ugly secret tucked into its guts, a hidden weakness that turned survivable hits into funerals. Officially, nothing was wrong. Officially, the Fortress was fine. Unofficially, planes kept coming back with holes that should have been minor, but instead killed systems, crews, and morale. Men on the ground began to whisper that this wasn't bad luck. It was a design nobody wanted to talk about. Bombers were falling from the sky planes that should have shrugged off damage, crippled by a quiet, deadly flaw, and the arithmetic was brutal. Missions returned with shredded wings and empty bunks. Official reports stayed polite and blind. The paperwork refused to name the problem. But the cemeteries did not take minutes. Families received medal and silence. Airmen whispered about freak losses that weren't freak at all, and crews learned to count luck like pennies. The secrecy wrapped the truth in red tape until someone on the ground decided he was done watching boys die for a design nobody would admit was wrong. They called it bad luck. The men came home in pieces, and the paperwork called it combat losses, but on the ground, one man kept seeing the same cruel pattern and ran out of patience. He was Staff Sergeant Paul Zuk, not a famed ace, not a decorated officer, just a grease-smeared mechanic with a temper grown sharp from watching boys pay for mistakes. He made a decision that night that would split his life in two. He would stop treating deaths as inevitable, quietly, recklessly, with his hands. He chose to fight the blueprint itself. On paper, Paul Zuk barely registered. His official aptitude scores were average. The Air Force dutifully stamped him for the motor pool, a grease monkey, a wrench wielder meant to follow orders and keep engines running until someone with a stripe and a plan told him otherwise. That neat little label fit the bureaucracy fine. It kept him out of pilot classrooms and away from delicate engineering meetings. But it also hid a problem for the men up in the air. The people in charge assumed competence could be measured by tests and rank, not by the stubborn, practical kind you get from fixing things to save lives. But Zuk's hands knew engines. They didn't learn from chalkboards or neat diagrams. They learned from cold mornings under a leaking porch roof, from radios and trucks, and a Model T hauled into the garage because someone had to keep it running. He learned to listen to metal, what a knock meant, how a pump would cough before it quit, and to turn whatever was on hand into whatever was needed. A bolt here, a hose there, a baling wire jury rig that somehow kept a machine alive. Survival taught him solutions, not rules. Make it work, or you don't eat. That blunt logic would make him useful and dangerous to the men with the manuals. That simple rule, make it work, or you don't eat, put him on a collision course with the entire U.S. military. In a world of manuals, checklists, and rigid procedures, obedience was survival. Grease was supposed to obey the book. Most mechanics learned to measure by the manual and to wait for replacement parts. Zuk's hands answered differently. He'd learned to read a wounded engine the way a doctor reads a pulse, to see a failure and know how to mend it before the next mission. That practical stubbornness wasn't just uncouth, it was dangerous to the brass. He could see the book was wrong. So when a cracked hydraulic line grounded a bomber, waiting simply wasn't an option. Rebellion often starts small. Here it begins with a cracked hydraulic line, one thin rubber tube split open by a stray flak fragment. The bomber sits on the field, grounded. No replacement part is in the supply chain. Standard procedure is one word: wait. Wait for parts, for orders, for paperwork. Wait while crews count caskets. For Zuk, wait is a betrayal. He watches the plane bleeding hydraulic fluid and thinks about who will fly it tomorrow. He doesn't wait. He decides, then and there, that a boy shouldn't die because a manual says so. Standard procedure was to wait. Zuk didn't. He crawled under the belly, found the cracked hydraulic line, and rather than search for a replacement he couldn't get, he rerouted the fluid with scavenged hose and a jury-rigged valve, carving a second path around the damage. He added manual cutoffs, redundancy where the blueprint had one fragile artery. It was rough, improvised, and against every regulation, but he wasn't merely repairing a part, he was rewiring the bomber's lifeblood so it could keep beating even after it was shot open. It doesn't take long before a pattern emerges. The B17 seconds Zuk's fingers touch develop a strange habit. They come home. They show up at dawn with fuselages rent, flak in the wings, wheels smoking, and hydraulic fluid like confetti down the runway. Crews climb out pale but alive. The instruments that should have failed, brakes, turrets, landing gear, are still ticking. Mechanics start whispering, pilots trade stories, and the airbase begins to tally coincidences that refuse to be coincidence. To everyone else it looks like luck. To Zuk, watching the lines he'd rerouted hold under fire, it looks like something else. They called it Zuk's luck, a shrugging, half-joking way to explain why certain battered fortresses staggered home while others never made it. Zuk didn't laugh. Luck had nothing to do with it. He'd watched pattern after pattern, missions and repairs, stacking up into a picture nobody else wanted to see, and the picture pointed to a single, brutal truth. The plane's life was concentrated in a few fragile lines and fittings, one lucky hit away from turning a flying fortress into a coffin. So he stopped hoping for miracles and started looking for the choke point. And then he began to fix it. The B-17 was a beautiful machine, streamlined, efficient, built to squeeze every ounce of range, lift and firepower out of steel and fabric. But that very elegance hid a brutal compromise. Its hydraulic and fuel plumbing ran like a single main artery through the wings and fuselage. In peacetime, that centralization made sense. Easier routing, less weight, simpler production. In combat, it was a death sentence. One lucky burst of flak, one jagged piece of shrapnel, and that single lifeline could be severed, turning a survivable hit into a crippled bomber with no brakes, no guns, no landing gear, a plane that, for all its genius, was suddenly helpless. That centralized plumbing made the Flying Fortress elegant on paper and lethal in practice. One lucky piece of shrapnel, fired from a flak battery or a fighter's cannon, could slice that main line and instantly kill the systems the crew depended on. Landing gear that wouldn't come down, turrets that couldn't turn, brakes that wouldn't hold. Suddenly, a plane that should have been able to limp home was a sitting duck, bleeding out at altitude with no way to control it. Survivable damage turned into a death sentence in seconds. It's the kind of design failure that doesn't stay theoretical. It becomes a tally of graves, and it's what pushed someone to break the rule book. Seeing that single point of failure, Zuk doesn't file a report. He goes to work. After the crews go home and the hangar lights dim, he creeps back in with a toolbox and a plan born of grease and necessity. By flashlight he cuts, splices, and reroutes scavenged hoses, jury-rigged fittings, handmade valves sewn into systems that were never meant to be tampered with. It's unauthorized surgery on flying metal. Each turn of the wrench is a risk, a court-martial, a reprimand, the end of a career. He does it anyway, because sitting back and watching boys die is not an option. He did more than patch holes. Zuk rewired the life of the bomber itself. At night, under work lamp glare and the smell of oil, he ran secret redundancy along skin and spar, snaking extra hydraulic and fuel lines where a single lucky burst of shrapnel could kill a plane. He fitted hand-turned valves behind panels, so a pilot could isolate a bleed in seconds, and tied alternate electrical feeds into circuits that Boeing never intended to be cross-linked. Each modification was cobbled from scavenged hose and brass fittings, crude but clever. Each one was also illegal. Every time he closed a wrench, he was not just saving men, he was betting his uniform, his freedom, even his life, against the rule book. By January 1944, Zuk had quietly touched 17 B-17 seconds in the 351st late-night surgeries with scavenged fittings and hand-cut valves, and what started as tinkering had begun to look like a pattern. Crews who flew those planes came back with stories, crippled wings, blown panels, but systems that still worked. Mechanics compared notes in hushed tones. The maintenance logs, when you actually looked, told the same story. These particular fortresses were surviving hits, the others were not. It wasn't folklore anymore. The numbers were stacking up, and the gap between maverick improvisation and undeniable proof was closing fast. The secret breaks on February 8th in a cold hangar lit by a single bulb. Captain Ronald Fletcher is doing a routine walk-around of the battered B-17 nicknamed Devil's Daughter when he sees it. 40 feet of hydraulic line snaking where nothing should be, 3 unfamiliar valves bolted into the wing like a surgeon's graft. Nothing in the Boeing manual shows this. Nothing in the logbook explains it. Fletcher's mouth goes dry. This is not a patch. It's a redesign. Someone has been rewriting the airplane's bloodwork, and whoever did it just turned a string of miracles into a smoking clue. After Fletcher's inspection, investigators traced the illegal lines back to a single set of hands. Paperwork, fingerprints, and hushed testimonies all pointed to one man. Staff Sergeant Paul Zuk, the grease-stained, rule-bending mechanic who lived in the hangars after dark, was identified and brought in. He didn't run. He sat across from his superiors, caught but steady. To the brass, it looked like a straightforward end, a maverick exposed. But for Zuk, and for the planes he'd secretly rebuilt, it was only the opening move. Cornered by his superiors, Zuk doesn't fold. He slides a battered logbook onto the table and lets it speak. It's the kind of thing grease monkeys keep. Dates, tail numbers, quick sketches, blunt notes scrawled in pencil. The room quiets as men trained to read reports suddenly read a mechanic's life. This isn't an admission of guilt. It's evidence, a ledger of hits and returns, torn metal and saved crews. He isn't pleading. He isn't apologizing. He is offering raw, stubborn proof that the rulebook was costing lives and that he'd already found a way to stop it. It isn't an admission of guilt. It's a record of survival. Zuk lays the logbook on the table and lets the pages do the talking: mission dates, damage reports, terse entries, and crude diagrams. He points, calm as a man teaching a simple lesson. 3 of his modified planes took direct hits to their primary hydraulic lines. All 3 came home. No appeals to authority, no patriotic rhetoric, just hard numbers and crew names who walked off those wrecked birds. The room, filled with uniforms and manuals, goes quiet. The evidence sits between them like a verdict they can't ignore. The discovery sends shockwaves up the chain of command. In windowless briefing rooms and on polished mess tables, the conversation stops cold. Colonel Albertson stares at the log like a man reading a verdict. Major Henry Watkins rubs his jaw and hears 2 futures. One where he signs papers that will put a maverick mechanic in the stocks, preserving doctrine and careers. Another where he quietly rewrites policy to save lives and risks everything he's built. This isn't just an administrative headache. It's a career-defining dilemma. Discipline the rule breaker or own his rebellion and reshape the war. The choice will decide more than one man's fate. Everything in the control tower feels wrong in the best possible way, a miracle on the runway that smells like trouble. The discovery has landed squarely on Colonel Albertson's desk and Major Henry Watkins' conscience. One man broke the rules, unlaced the manual, and suddenly planes that should never have come back are walking away from combat. Do you court-martial the mechanic who flagrantly broke every regulation to do it? Or do you listen to the man who, against orders, is somehow saving your crews? It's not just a legal question. It's moral, tactical, career-ending, and life-saving all at once, and the next choice will decide which. Major Watkins stares at the logbook until the ink stops being just handwriting and becomes proof. Dates, missions, hits, and returns an ugly, undeniable pattern. He knows what the safe choice looks like: bury it, punish the rule breaker, keep the paperwork clean. He also knows what the honest choice looks like: try to save men. So he bets his career on the latter. He signs the orders, calls in officers, and authorizes a formal investigation into Zuk's alterations. It's a quiet, dangerous act of defiance that turns a mechanic's secret into an official problem the Air Force can't ignore. The investigation doesn't blink. Zuk's unauthorized surgery, illegal by every manual, had exposed and fixed a single, deadly design flaw in the B-17. Data, not rumor, backs it up. Telemetry, maintenance logs, and the survival patterns of damaged aircraft all point the same way. The report calls it what it is: a flagrant breach of orders that nevertheless resolves an undeniable vulnerability that has been killing crews. Suddenly, the moral calculus flips. This isn't just about a rule breaker. It's about saving men. For the brass, the choice narrows down to discipline or adoption, and one officer will push for the latter against every expectation. Watkins does the unexpected. No court-martial. He won't punish the man who's been keeping boys alive. Instead, he proposes something radical. Not a memo, not a slow technical review, but a formal public test. Put Zuk's cobbled redundancies up against Boeing's designs and let the air war be the laboratory. That means instrumented B-17 seconds flying real missions, engineers watching telemetry, brass with reputations on the line. If Zuk's fixes fail, careers, maybe lives, are at risk. If they work, the entire industry will be forced to change. Either way, this turns a secret rebellion into a fight the system can't ignore. The rebellion is no longer a secret. What started as whispered jury rigging in the dark corners of the hangar has become a headline problem on the brass's desk, and suddenly, Zuk's mess of hoses and valves is everybody's problem. He's a staff sergeant who broke the rules to save lives. The system he defied is a machine built on ranks, manuals, and reputations. That machine doesn't like being contradicted, especially not by a grease-stained kid from Pittsburgh. If Zuk's right, careers and doctrine will have to change. If he's wrong, he'll take the fall. The odds are stacked, and the next move comes from the other side of the Atlantic. They flew in the experts from Seattle's slick suits, white shirts, slide rules and charts carried in on a plane that smelled faintly of polished metal, not burning fuel. Their lead, Carlson, is everything Zuk has never been. College-trained, buttoned up, a man who trusts calculations more than combat scars. He arrives like the verdict of an institution. The base goes quiet when he walks past a battered B-17, cataloging parts with a clinical eye, as if the war were a problem set. For the men on the flight line, this is the moment their homemade rebellion meets the machine that built the fortress, and the stakes just got much higher. Carlson is appalled. He stands over the belly of a disassembled B-17, forehead creased, and points at Zuk's improvised bypass lines with open contempt. To him, those braided hoses and hand-built valves look like jury-rigged hacks, an affront to every calculation on his drawings. He jabs a finger, voice clipped, cataloging every theoretical risk he can imagine. Around him, the brass stiffen. The room shifts from curiosity to judgment. This is the moment theory collides with the greasy, stubborn reality of the flight line. Carlson steps up, severe and precise, and lectures the brass on fluid dynamics, pressure tolerances, and contamination risks. Technical rules written by men with degrees and slide rules. He points at Zuk's bypass lines and warns that a stray particle or a pressure spike will kill a system, not save it, insisting the jury rig is reckless, not heroic. Carlson's face goes hard as a rivet. He points at the tangle of hoses and jury-rigged valves, like a prosecutor laying out an indictment. This isn't cleverness, he says. It's a dangerous gamble, a threat to the aircraft and the men who fly them. He rattles off worst-case scenarios: contamination, catastrophic failure, a stalled crew with no margin for error, and the room leans in, swallowing his verdict. The tone is absolute. It smells of authority and conveyor belt logic. In the doorway, Zuk stands with grease on his hands and a quiet look in his eye, listening as if he's already heard the charge 100 times. Zuk stands there in grease-stained coveralls, palms still dark from the workbench, as Carlson rattles off equations and cautions like a sermon: pressure tolerances, contamination, the sanctity of the manual. The officers nod. The room feels smaller. Zuk listens, patient and steady, then cuts through the jargon with one small, devastating question that lands like a wrench. When's the last time you flew a combat mission? The room hums with air of superiority, Carlson lecturing in crisp jargon while Zuk stands silent in his grease-stained coveralls, listening like a man who's seen the machine die. Then Zuk leans forward and asks, simple and blunt, "When's the last time you flew a combat mission?" The question lands like a cold hand. Pause. Carlson bristles. In that one line, Zuk draws a line between theory and blood, between slide rules and shrapnel, and the argument shifts no longer abstract engineering, but the hard logic of survival. Carlson bristles and snaps, "I'm an engineer, not a pilot," his voice tight with offended expertise, the kind that turns a room into a lecture hall. He straightens, points to diagrams, and fires off words tolerances, contamination, SEAL integrity terms meant to shut down improvisation. The officers nod, reassured by familiar formulas. Zuk, grease on his sleeves, watches him with a quiet look that says he's already seen the math fail in the sky. The tension hangs there, book knowledge versus bloody experience. And in that pause, you can hear the argument's stakes. This isn't about pride. It's about whether men fly home or don't. Zuk nods, the motion small but deliberate, then delivers the line like a verdict. Right. You designed this in Seattle, where the worst that happens is a failed pressure test. The room tightens, engineers in starched shirts, brass with folded arms, and Zuk in grease-dark coveralls, all hearing the same challenge. It's a jab at distance and theory, a reminder that blueprints don't bleed. He isn't trying to be clever. He's pointing out a blind spot they all accept because they're not the ones bringing shattered planes home. The remark hangs in the air, a simple truth that reframes the whole argument. "I fix it when it comes back with holes in it," Zuk said, looking each officer in the eye, different perspective. He spoke without flourish, just plain, stubborn certainty, and for a beat, the room went quiet. Carlson's jaw tightened. The colonel's pen paused over his notes. Zuk's coveralls still smelled of oil and burnt hydraulic fluid, the proof of where he'd earned his authority. He wasn't arguing theory. He was arguing survival. He wasn't asking permission. He was holding up a record of planes that came home. The words landed like a challenge, and you could feel two worlds about to collide. The tension in the hangar was almost physical, like two different worlds pressing against each other. On one side, Carlson in his clean shirt, pocket protector, charts, and slide rules. The sterile logic of Seattle engineering. On the other, Zuk in grease-stained coveralls, hands that had fixed things that came back with holes in them. A battlefield pragmatist who measured success in men who lived. Theory versus brutal reality. Words ricocheted across that gulf, polite but deadly. Confidence met experience, and neither would yield. Every officer in the room felt the weight of the choice: follow the manual, or trust the man who'd already saved lives. Major Watkins surprises the room by choosing what the men in coveralls already know. Reality beats theory. He sides with the grease-stained evidence over slide rule certainty and lays down a dare: no more lab tinkering, no ground tests, no simulations. If anyone wants to prove Zuk wrong, prove it where it counts. In the air, under fire. It's reckless, it's radical, it's exactly what the situation demands. He proposes to instrument a handful of Zuk's modified fortresses and let the war become the laboratory, trading paperwork for raw data and risking crews to settle a fight between engineering and experience. Major Watkins doesn't want lab reports. He wants proof where it matters in the sky. So they rig 5 of Zuk's cobbled-up B-17 seconds with instruments, pressure gauges, extra lines of telemetry, cameras trained on the wing routes, and hydraulic trunks. Then they do the unthinkable, they send them into combat. The air war over Germany becomes the laboratory. Every spline, every valve, every improvisation will be measured under enemy fire. If Zuk is right, the numbers will vindicate him. If he's wrong, men will pay. There are no safety nets here, only raw data and the roar of flak. From March 5 to 18, the 5 modified B-17 seconds flew 11 missions into the teeth of the Reich's defenses. They struck factories, ball-bearing plants, airfields. On 3 sorties, flak and fighters found their Mark engines shredded, control surfaces scarred, hydraulic lines bleeding. But every time, crews fought their way home. Zuk's tinkering was being tested in blood and iron. Each mission the same. Battered B-17 seconds streak back across the channel, engines coughing, skin shredded, crews white and exhausted. They land. They climb out. Panels torn, radios scarred, but the critical systems still work. Zuk's improvisations hold. Pilots whisper it into briefings. Mechanics start copying his lines in the dark. It feels like a miracle. The real test, though, hasn't happened yet. On March 18th, the moment of truth arrives. The Memphis Belle II punches through heavy cloud and into a wall of German flak shells blooming like black sunflowers, each burst rattling skin and metal. The plane shudders, a wing takes a savage hit, instruments in the monitoring room back in England, and flicker. Men at consoles go quiet. Nobody knows yet if Zuk's improvised lifelines will hold. A shell rips open near the wing root. In the monitoring room, engineers watch the primary hydraulic feed, and it flatlines. Pressure plunges to 0 in 4.2 seconds. Gauges slam to empty. Radios crackle. For a moment, every calculation, every unauthorized valve, every hope hangs in the balance as the bomber loses its lifeblood mid-flight. For a breath, the bomber is a corpse, a dead stick in the sky with every warning light screaming and the primary hydraulic feed gone cold. Flaps, brakes, turrets, even the landing gear are suddenly paperwork on a crippled machine. Down in the control room, the telemetry flatlined and the air went out of the room. Men who'd spent weeks arguing about fittings and tolerances just stare at needles stuck at 0 and imagine the worst. A crew with no control, no margin, tumbling toward a fate that could have been prevented. For a moment, it looks like Zuk's gamble has failed, and someone will pay with their life. Inside the cockpit, amid screaming gauges and the smell of burnt wiring, the pilot does exactly what Zuk taught him: no hesitation, no second guessing. He had been briefed on a cold morning in the hangar, shown 3 levers that didn't exist in any manual, and told when to turn them if the worst ever happened. Now, with hydraulic pressure bleeding away and the formation thinning, his hands move with practiced calm. It's a small, precise ritual: listen, reach, twist, carried out, because a grease-stained mechanic once refused to accept it can't be done. He reaches down and twists 3 simple, manually installed valves hardware that wasn't in any Boeing blueprint. The knobs are crude and dented, welded together in a cold hangar at night. 1 click, 2 clicks. The 3rd turns, and you can almost hear a mechanical heartbeat restart somewhere inside the wing. On the ground, the needles that had gone flat twitch, then climb again. On the ground, the room of engineers and officers held its breath, watching the telemetry. Monitors glowed like altars. The needle hovered at 0. Time stretched thin. Men leaned forward, mouths shut, fingers still. Even the radio hummed louder than any voice, everyone waiting for one tiny sign. Then, as if someone had reached inside the plane and restarted its heart, a second set of needles springs to life on the console. The backup line kicks in. Pressure stabilizes. The telemetry that had gone flat now murmurs again, steady, stubborn, proof. For a beat, the room exhales as one. Faces that had turned to stone loosen. Radios click, hands move, but most of all there is a small, impossible thing. A bomber has a pulse. It is not theory anymore. It is raw, desperate survival, visible in glowing dials and trembling men, and for the first time since the hit, hope is real. The room falls into a stunned hush as the instruments come alive, little needles twitching like a pulse returning. For a few impossible seconds, they watch what looks like a ghost performing, metal and tubing that should be dead, answering to a hand on 3 valves, breathing hydraulics back into a crippled bomber. It's not magic. It's crude, stubborn engineering, rowdy, messy, and somehow perfect for the moment the clean theory failed. Men who spent their lives trusting manuals now watch a field fix prove the manuals wrong, and in that silence, everyone understands the scale of what just happened. Against every expectation, the Memphis Belle II holds formation wounded, but steady cuts through flak like a stubborn shadow and completes its run. Bombs away. The crew breathes, but not easy yet. They still have a crippled bird to nurse home. The backup hydraulics hum to life when needed. Manual valves doing what blueprints never allowed. The bomber limps back across the channel, touches down hard, and rolls to a stop on a single set of tired wheels. Engines wind down. Silence hangs for a heartbeat. Then the field erupts in shouts and hurried hands as the crew climbs free alive. The test is over. What began as a whispered hack in a drafty hangar is no longer rumor or desperate hope. It's inked into the instruments and impossible to argue with. Needles that should have stayed flat sprang back to life. Manual valves and scavenged hose work, and not by accident, but by design, by a mechanic who'd watched too many crews not come home. 11 combat flights, a wall of flak, and a bomber that should have died returned breathing. The telemetry reads like a verdict. Zuks' fix saved lives. In that instant, theory became proof, and the world the manuals defended got a little smaller. The test is over, and in the cramped monitoring room, the hum of equipment feels louder than any celebration because there is none. Carlson, the Boeing man who came with certainties and slide rules, sits frozen, eyes fixed on the playback, as if the screen itself broke some law he believed in. Needles that should have died leap back to life. Numbers that shouldn't exist hold steady. Around him, officers shift. Someone swallows. Zuk stands at the back with grease under his nails and a quiet that says everything. Carlson's jaw tightens. His hands curl into fists, and for the first time, he has no words. Carlson finally turns to Major Watkins, and for the first time, his engineer's armor cracks. The confident lecturer is suddenly quiet. This shouldn't work, he admits, the words flat and stunned in the humming monitoring room, as if admitting the instruments have lied to him. He had built his certainty on equations and tolerances, not on bloodied aircraft limping home. Now the data sits in front of him, cold and undeniable, and it has undone a career of certainty in one terrible, beautiful moment. The room exhales. All eyes slide to the back, where a grease-stained mechanic waits to explain what the textbooks missed. Carlson sits frozen in front of the monitors, the numbers replaying like an accusation, and finally the man who built the theory says what nobody expected. The dynamics, the filtration, it's all wrong. But it does work. I don't understand why. The room exhales, as if a held breath has been released. His voice is small, stunned. This is the moment the neat certainty of classrooms and slide rules bumps up against soot-streaked reality, and for the first time the expert has no answer, only a confession. It leaves a gap in the air, an invitation for the grease-stained mechanic in the back to fill. From the back of the room, grease on his palms and oil under his nails, Zuk speaks up quiet, plain, impossible to ignore. He doesn't trot out equations or jargon. He points instead to scars on returning airframes, to his logbook of missions and busted lines and planes that should have stayed down but didn't. His explanation is simple and blunt. The factory blueprint assumes everything stays tidy. Combat doesn't. So he built for chaos extra lines, manual valves, easy fixes a crew could use under fire. It's an unofficial, battle-tested logic, and in that room it suddenly carries the weight of lives. From the back of the room, Zuk leans forward and gives them the blunt answer they didn't want to hear. It works because I designed it to work when everything's already gone to hell. Your system works great, until it doesn't. Short, ugly, and true. He didn't tinker for elegance or paperwork. He built a way to buy time when the plane was bleeding out. Redundant lines, simple manual valves, fixes a pilot can flip with a glove on. It wasn't engineering for the showroom. It was engineering for the goosebumps of combat. The room goes quiet. The numbers are staring them in the face. The data is irrefutable. Charts, telemetry, and survival logs all point the same way. Zuks fixes saved planes that should have been lost. But bureaucracy moves slower than a crippled bomber. Committees form, memos are written, and the very processes meant to keep men safe insist on tests, signatures, and the distant nod of headquarters. Meetings stretch into days. Engineers in Seattle dispatch cautious cable. Lawyers ask questions nobody on the line has time to answer. On the flight line, though, men stare at those numbers and don't need a stamp to understand them. While the papers shuffle, something quietly begins to happen. While the brass tucks the proof into memos and slow-moving reports, something much faster is happening on the tarmac, a rumor that becomes a movement. Mechanics trade stories between engine stands and mess halls, grease-stained hands sketching bypasses on scrap paper, swapping scavenged valves, and lengths of hose like contraband. A whisper in one hangar is a radio call in another. By dawn, the idea has jumped units and squadrons. It travels in the quiet hours, men hunched over charts, copying Zuks tweaks under a single lamp because the rules move slow, but the need to keep crews alive moves faster than any order. They didn't wait for orders from headquarters. The men on the flight line had seen enough funerals. Saving the crew mattered more than waiting for a signature. So, in the long nights between missions, grease-stained mechanics copied Zuk's work from memory, splicing in bypasses, bolting on manual valves, scavenging parts until a crippled system had a second chance. It was illegal and improvisational, but it was deliberate. Word spread by wrench and whisper from hangar to hangar, and soon whole squadrons were quietly installing the fixes that kept men alive. By mid-April, the contagion had reached the place no one expected. The high-loss 100th Bomb Group, the infamous Bloody 100th, started retrofitting Zuk's handiwork onto their own flying fortresses. That was the turning point, when a unit that counted its losses in whole crews chose to gamble on a grease-stained fix. The whisper became a tide. Standing in the maintenance shack, Master Sergeant Robert Chen wasn't cheering or preaching. He opened a ledger. He began keeping his own stats, logging missions, damage reports, and returns with a quiet, almost obsessive precision. Someone was finally measuring whether hope could be turned into proof. Master Sergeant Robert Chen didn't believe in hearsay. He kept a ledger, a tally of sorties and scratch marks for every wounded fortress that limped back to England. Night after night he compared planes patched by the book with the ones that wore Zuk's extra lines and valves. The numbers were brutal and simple. A B17 with Zuk's modifications and battle damage was roughly 3 times more likely to make it home than one without. That kind of math isn't an argument, it's a verdict. Suddenly, Zuk's stubborn, rule-breaking grease jobs weren't folklore on the flight line. They were cold, undeniable evidence the brass couldn't ignore. Eventually, a limited technical order comes down from the top. Authorize the hydraulic fix and nothing more. On paper, it looks like progress. In practice, it feels like a compromise. Boeing, clinging to blueprints and liability, signs off on the hydraulics but waves away the fuel and electrical mods as unnecessary risks. Contamination, complexity, unproven jury rigging, their words. The memo calms headquarters. It doesn't satisfy the flight lines. For mechanics who'd already seen patched-up planes come home, the partial answer is literally a bandage on an artery. It helps. But it isn't enough, and that gap will force a choice on the ground. They didn't wait for permission. Under blackout lights and behind hangar doors, Zuk and the grease-stained mechanics who'd watched too many boys not come back quietly ignored the partial order and bolted the whole package onto every plane they could touch: extra fuel and electrical bypasses, manual valves, redundant lines, works of defiance, soldered with scavenged brass and stubborn common sense. It was risky, it was illegal, and it was simple. If the manual failed men, they'd trust their hands instead. Word spread in whispers, then in practice. One clandestine fix became a quiet, unstoppable movement across the flight line. The war in Europe ends. The roar fades, and, for the first time, there is room to breathe and to count. In a quiet headquarters office, amid stacks of mission reports and grease-specked logbooks, the true scale of Zuk's quiet insurrection finally comes into focus. What had looked like rule-breaking on a hangar floor begins to read like a pattern. Damaged bombers that should have been lost, crews who should have been listed among the dead, planes brought home by jury-rigged valves and bypass lines. The fixes that once invited scorn now whisper a different story of lives preserved, odds shifted, and someone at a desk begins the tedious work of proving it. In that quiet headquarters office, Captain Dorothy Henshaw sat alone with a mountain of mission reports, maintenance logs, and grim little checklists, paperwork no one wanted to touch until the war was over. She fed the numbers into charts, cross-checked return rates against repair sheets, and let the data speak. What emerged wasn't a theory or an anecdote. It was a hard, cold pattern. The planes altered in the field were coming back at a rate nobody in uniform expected. Dorothy's face changed as the columns filled in, staggering, undeniable. This wasn't tinkering anymore. It was proof that someone's stubborn hands had been buying lives. When Captain Dorothy Henshaw finally ran the numbers, the results wiped away any lingering doubt. Bomb groups that adopted Zuk's full suite of modifications saw return rates jump by more than 23%. Not an abstract improvement, but roughly 347 fewer bombers lost, and, by conservative estimates, thousands of airmen who walked off the tarmac instead of boarding wooden coffins to be sent home. Those digits translate into fathers and brothers who came back, missions that didn't end in silence, and entire squadrons kept in the fight. In short, Zuk didn't just tweak hardware, he changed the math of survival. Those numbers weren't academic. An 81% survival rate for a Zuk-modified B-17 versus 47% for an unmodified bird was almost literally the difference between life and death for the men aboard, nearly doubling a crew's chance of coming home. Stacked across squadrons that adopted his fixes, those percentages added up to hundreds of bombers spared the scrapyard and thousands fewer names on casualty lists. It was blunt arithmetic with enormous human consequence. In a war measured in sorties and tonnage, Paul Zuk had quietly rewritten the odds, not with paperwork, but with grease, guts, and a stubborn refusal to accept that's how it is. Paul Zuk was honorably discharged in 1945. He walked away a civilian with little fanfare. For risking his career, even his freedom to save thousands of airmen, the Air Force gave him a standard medal for general technical proficiency. No parade, no public commendation. Just a ribbon and a paper trail that didn't capture what he'd done. He could have demanded recognition, sued for credit, but Zuk didn't. He fixed planes, not egos. That quiet, almost bitterly ordinary end only underlines the story's point. Sometimes the people who change history do it with grease on their hands and no expectation of glory. He got nothing more than a routine medal. No parade, no press. When Paul Zuk left the Air Force in 1945, he went home to Pittsburgh, opened a small repair shop, and folded his war into the quiet of ordinary life. He never told the customers who watched him fix a carburetor or straighten a fender what he'd done to save men in the sky. For decades, he kept his hands busy and his mouth shut. It wasn't a statement. It was habit one born of grease, guilt, and a stubborn belief that a life saved didn't need a ribbon. Still, his work quietly lived on. His modifications, however, lived on not on a plaque, not under his name, but folded into the steel of the airplane itself. Factory drawings were revised, lines rerouted, valves added, and the final B-17G rolled out with what the paperwork blandly called general engineering updates. In workshops across England, the same jury-rigged fixes that had kept crews alive became standard practice. What began as a greasy, unauthorized hack turned into a quiet, lethal improvement in aircraft survivability. No headlines followed. No heroes parade. Just fewer funerals, more men walking out of damaged planes, and a safety the books never credited to the mechanic who'd first dared to break them. By the time the war moved on, the quiet, practical fixes Zuk stitched into battered B-17 seconds had crept into the drawing boards of America's next heavy bombers. Twin hydraulic runs, manual bypass valves, and reroutes meant to survive shrapnel found their way into the B-29 and later the B-50, not as heroic folklore, but as cold, official engineering updates. What started as backyard improvisation became doctrine. Small redundancies multiplied across airframes, turning isolated miracles into repeatable survivability. The machines got smarter, the pilots lived longer. The credit, like Zuk, stayed mostly invisible, hidden in the margins of technical reports. Years later, when a historian finally asked him why he'd risked rank, reputation, even prison to break the rules, Zuk didn't reach for drama. He shrugged, wiped his hands on a rag, and said it plain, "The planes were wrong. The manual was wrong." I could see the fix. It wasn't a hard choice. To him, the decision wasn't about defiance or glory, it was about numbers, about boys sent over a target, and the thin line between coming home and a wooden box. He fixed what he could, quietly, because someone had to. Paul Zuk died an unsung hero, no monuments, no headlines, just a small medal and a Pittsburgh repair shop where he went back to turning wrenches and rarely speaking of the men he'd kept alive. His name never ran across factory blueprints, but his work did. Crews copied his fixes in the field, survival rates climbed, and the lessons of redundancy quietly reshaped bomber design for generations. His legacy isn't bronze, it's written in grease and hydraulic fluid, in planes that came home because one stubborn mechanic refused to accept the manual. Share this story to honor an unsung hero and subscribe for more stories of hidden genius.